I've got a plinth to speak from. Writing in the Yearbook of the Canadian Arts in 1929, Merrill Dennison, who was one of the leaders of the sort of Canadian theatre movements of the 1920s, wrote, "I find writing about the Canadian theatre or drama to be depressingly like discussing the art of dinghy sailing among the Bedouins. There is so little to be said on the subject, save to point out that there is none." 4 years later, Ed Cecil Smith wrote in a letter to the Canadian Forum, which is a left-wing, I'm not even sure if it's still published, but is it still being published? No, I thought it had passed away. But the long-standing left-leaning journal in Canada, he wrote a letter saying, writing about the workers' theatre that was developing, he says, "Here is the new Canadian dramatic movement in very truth. A drama rooted in the lives and struggles of the toilers of Canadians' shops, mines, farms, and slave camps. Plays written in the heat of life by the same workers. Mass recitations and plays presented by worker actors who understand what they are doing because they live the very parts they take. Believe me, Mr. Editor, there is no tripe put on by these groups. Life to these Canadians is too serious to worry about polite bedroom scandals or the ridiculous cavortings of a flat-footed detective in pursuit of the black ace." So what we're looking at here is it's actually quite a very short period of time in sort of literary and Canadian history and theatre history, which really goes from about 1929 or 1930 up to the Second World War, up to 1940. And this workers' theatre, as you can tell from our mass recitation that we just had, and the letter from Ed Cecil Smith, was very sort of strongly left-leaning, community-oriented theatre. And looking at that period, there are two sort of main parts of this 10-year period. And I'm calling the first period, 1931 to 1933, the Agitprop Era, and then 1935 to 1940, the theatre of action. And these two periods generally coincide with an international communist strategy through this period of time. Up to 1933, the international communist strategy about mobilizing workers was quite confrontational and single-minded. It was an era when the CCF, which is the forerunner of the NDP and various other groups like that, were accused of being pawns of capitalist structure, even to the point of calling them social fascists. So this was the beginnings of a group of communists in Canada who are feeling very, very strongly and are quite confrontational, as I said. Now, after 1935, and a little bit earlier in Europe, after a council in Moscow in 1933, there is the development of what is known as the Popular Front. And the Popular Front developed and was an international communist and leftist movement that was based on the understanding that there was going to be no socialist state until fascism was defeated. And so that the left-leaning groups decided to build alliances with other left-leaning groups rather than be confrontational with them, and to encourage the defeat of people like Franco, Hitler, and Mussolini. This second era, from 1935 to 1940, is actually sort of a little bit better known, mostly through the professionalized productions of such plays as Waiting for Lefty, which is in some ways one of the sort of hallmarks of left-leaning theatre in the 30s. And also such groups as the Federal Theatre Project in the US, and the beginnings of the laboratory theatre and the workshop theatre in England under the direction of Ewan MacColl. And the aesthetic of this time, of this second era, is basically on realism. And it could be argued, and I think it's a reasonable argument, that this is the way that Stanislavski-style acting really took hold in North America, particularly through the popularity of groups like the Group Theatre in New York, who were the producers of Clifford Odets' Waiting for Lefty, which was the super big hit of this sort of left-leaning theatre. And most of the Stanislavski-style acting, the groups that started that were, like the Group Theatre, started as left-wing theatre companies. So there in Toronto, this period of time is associated with a company that was called the Theatre of Action, which aimed for a professional level of production and helped develop, through the course of this sort of 5 or 6 years, developed and worked with a number of people who went on to having fairly major and important careers in the professional theatre in Canada, including Frank Schuster from Wayne & Schuster, Lauren Green, who taught at the Theatre of Action Theatre School, and Ben Lennox, who was a long-standing member of Canadian Actors' Equity. And these productions in this second period were of major international scripts. So this is a period where this group has picked up on this realistic aesthetic. A number of members of this company had gone to New York to study with the group theater and people like that, and came back and usually did American scripts. They did, the Theatre of Action did Waiting for Lefty, as did most progressive left-leaning arts theatre groups across Canada and across the States. They did a couple of anti-war plays by Irwin Shaw called Bury the Dead, and also some other, well, they did actually a German-Soviet play called War China by Tretyakov. And then as the period moved on, they became more professionalized and less sort of solid and sort of staunch in their political standpoint. And in fact, their last productions were things like The Inspector General by Gogol. So they had moved away from this kind of harder sort of sensibility about political production, as it were, into a more professionalized, but trying to create a theatre that was interested in social issues while being professional, having a high standard. Aesthetically, the first era is often looked at as being a bit primitive and amateurish, both by scholars, the few scholars who have actually studied 30s left-wing theatre in Canada. Actually, I'm deeply indebted to Alan Fallis of the University of Guelph, who actually has written a fair bit on this and who is important in my sort of thinking on this. By scholars and also in memoirs. One of the main sources we have for information on the Canadian theatre in this period is a book by a woman named Toby Gordon Ryan called Stage Left. And she was active in this movement right from the very beginning, from 1929 right up until 1940 and onwards. And she was, and in her memoirs, she does also sort of look down upon this first era as being a little bit, as I say, amateurish, primitive, not artistic enough. But this is the period of time I'm going to concentrate on today. Because I think it's, in some ways, it's actually more fascinating. It is for me, anyways. And it is in this period, for me, the reason I want to concentrate on it is it's in this period that Canada is really struggling on its own, and it comes up with its own responses, whether responding to Canadian incident or in finding Canadian writers. So that the Workers' Experimental Theatre, which is the sort of the company of this first 1933 to 1935 section, did a lot more work by Canadians than the Theatre of Action did, in fact. So there's this kind of interesting shift when it comes to sort of when things become professionalized and aesthetics, and there's a governing aesthetic. Also, the aesthetic is lesser known. So the idea is to, as we want to think about history and things that we can sort of put to use again, the aesthetic is lesser known and respected, and for me, therefore, a little bit more interesting to look at. And as a kind of an interesting sort of sidelight, it is the time when Canada actually manages a major production that is effective politically and aesthetically challenging. And I'll be talking about this. It's a production of a play called 8 Men Speak. And this is actually before the emergence of a similar sized work in either New York or England. It predates Waiting for Lefty by 2 years, and the British show Newsboy, which was one of the first living newspapers produced by the Workshop Theatre, which are considered the major works of the sort of left-leaning theatre of the 1930s. And to my mind, that's a mistake. There's no real reason, to my mind, to suggest that 8 Men Speak is particularly worse than Waiting for Lefty or the other things. It actually has a lot of very, very interesting and strong political and aesthetic ideas sort of in it. So that's the other sort of main point I'd like to sort of bring up.